Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Carmel Sepuloni.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll just start by saying, of course, we'll be supporting this to first reading, Mr Speaker, and I have to say it has been a long time coming. Back in October 2015, the bill that I had drawn out of the members' ballot to make social worker registration was debated in the House, and it was unfortunate that at that time we had the support of some of the parties, but not all. So we didn't have the support of ACT, we didn't have the support of Peter Dunn and United Future, and we didn't have the support of National. It was equally as disappointing at the time that I had met with every political party to discuss that members' bill and the importance of mandatory social worker registration. And even the minister herself at the time couldn't say there was anything in the bill that I had drafted that she disagreed with. She just said it was about timing. Well, timing, Mr Speaker, let's talk about timing, because actually when I looked back even further, when Labor was in government near the end of its term in 2008, we were on our way to actually making social worker registration mandatory. And the minister herself was on record in the Hansard pushing for this to happen, pushing very hard, in fact, for this to happen, a great advocate for social worker registration. And yet here we are, 9 years into that National Government's term, and it's taken them this long to get this to first reading. And I have to say, there was no need for an inquiry. There was no need for the Social Services Select Committee to undertake an inquiry. We could have done the same work if the government had just supported my members' bill to Select Committee that we ended up doing, a year later, and we would have been ahead of the game, Mr Speaker. And it's not just about who wins or does someone win with regards to getting a bill up and whose name was on it, who led it. It's about the fact that this is actually a really important and urgent issue. We've had the recommendations come from the different advisory groups to say that actually it's imperative that we have a qualified and registered workforce working with our most vulnerable children and families, Mr Speaker. So it shouldn't have been delayed, and it didn't need to be delayed at all. Mr Speaker, the bill does much of what we had proposed in the members' bill that I had in the ballot that was drawn, that was voted against by National. Essentially, it makes it so that a person may only call themselves a social worker, whether through names, titles, descriptions, abbreviations, etc., if they are a registered social worker and hold a current practising certificate. And that's so important because actually a few years ago a survey was undertaken and the general public were assumed that anyone who called themselves a social worker actually had the qualifications and was registered and regulated by a body of some sort. So they were under the assumption that that was already the case, but in fact it wasn't the case. And we'd had multiple incidents in the media where people who had been employed as social workers or called themselves social workers, where they had been done in the courts for criminal activity and they had been trusted in positions as a social worker, Mr Speaker, when they shouldn't have had that title because it was misleading. The public assumes that people who have that title have the qualifications and are regulated in some way or another, and that hasn't been the case. So we support the fact that that title will be protected once we get through this process. There have been concerns raised. I've had the Aotearoa New Zealand Association of Social Workers get in contact with me about this bill. They're happy that it's finally at this point and that we are moving towards making social worker registration mandatory. The concern they raise is that social workers or people with a social worker qualification could actually be employed in a role that isn't titled social worker, like probation officer, family advocate, youth worker, and that there will be no expectation that those people be registered as social workers because they're not practising formally under the title of social worker. And we've had that discussion. I've had that discussion with them. That's a point, I'm sure, that will be nutted out and discussed even further and will be evident in the submissions that are received by Parliament when it gets to Select Committee. At this point in time, I have said to the Aotearoa New Zealand Association of Social Workers that I'm at this point in time on the side of just protecting the title of social worker, and if we were going to go down the track of actually regulating those other positions, then that's a completely different piece of work, I think, to what we're discussing here in the House today. Also, I think, knowing I've been a teacher, qualified teacher, you can be a qualified teacher who might go on to other positions outside of the state schooling sector where you may tutor or whatever else, but there's no expectation in those situations that you'll maintain your registration. And I think that's the kind of immediate comparison that I think of. But it's still up for discussion, and as I said to the Aotearoa New Zealand Association of Social Workers, person who I've been speaking to, this is something that we can discuss further at Select Committee. They can present us with the evidence there, and we can go through the process with regards to that. Mr Speaker, I don't really have much to say on this bill because we are going to be supporting it. I think I've made the key points. It's a long time coming. We could have done it ages ago. The government didn't need to hold this up. And, Mr Speaker, I'm looking forward to, hopefully, being part of the next Parliament where we get to debate this further and where we can actually realise a mandatory social worker registration. Thank you.
Joe Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And before I